When the British Empire expanded across the globe, it did not only bring soldiers, merchants, and flags. Laws written in London became laws in distant lands. Courts, judges, and regulations followed ships and forts. These laws shaped society, controlled trade, and influenced everyday life in colonies. They built order, but also created tension. They offered protection for some, and restriction for others. This is the story of British law in the colonies. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today, and thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Today, we explore how Britain extended its legal system across continents. How laws were written, enforced, and taught. How justice looked different depending on who lived under it. For some, British law brought predictability, trade protection, and social order. For others, it limited local traditions, authority, and autonomy. Was British law a gift of order, or a tool of control over people far from home? Share your thoughts as we begin. Foundations of Colonial Law 1600 to 1700. The story begins along distant shores, where British ships brought settlers, traders, and officials to lands far from London. In the early 17th century, settlements took root in North America, the Caribbean, and parts of India. These were fragile communities at first, relying on supply ships, local knowledge, and improvisation. Yet from the earliest days, there was a principle that would shape them all: the authority of law. Local councils were formed to manage daily life. Settlers gathered to discuss regulations, resolve disputes, and plan the organization of towns and villages. They acted as intermediaries between the distant crown and the people on the ground. Decisions made in council chambers reflected a balance of local needs and imperial expectations. They were the first threads of governance, linking colonies to Londona's authority. Governors enforced rules sent from the crown. Appointed officials arrived with instructions, charters, and expectations. They carried the weight of British law across oceans. Their role was both practical and symbolic. When a governor issued a decree or settled a dispute, it was a demonstration that English legal principles applied, even in unfamiliar lands. Authority was established not by volume, but by consistency. Colonists quickly learned that rules originating thousands of miles away still carried consequences. Courts applied English law, adapted to distant circumstances. Judges presided over cases involving property, trade, contracts, and disputes between settlers. They interpreted statutes, balancing traditional principles with local conditions. Sometimes adjustments were necessary. Climate, geography, and culture influenced enforcement. Yet the core of English law, the notions of precedent, fairness, and obligation remained. Justice was no longer only an abstract ideal. It became tangible, visible, and present in everyday interactions. Colonists observed that British legal principles carried authority, even across oceans. A fine imposed for breaking trade rules. A sentence handed down for theft. Or a contract enforced in court. All demonstrated that imperial law was real and binding. Compliance became both a practical necessity and a form of loyalty. People understood that recognition of authority could secure safety, resources, and order. Law taught settlers how the empire expected behavior. Long before formal communication could arrive from London. The empire's expectations. These first legal systems were small, modest, and experimental. Council meetings occurred in modest chambers. Courts convened under simple roofs. And records were kept on fragile parchment. Yet their influence grew over time. They became frameworks for commerce, settlement, and social relations. They defined rights and responsibilities, creating shared expectations among settlers. The presence of law created a sense of stability. An invisible structure that shaped daily life. In the Caribbean, courts managed disputes over land, labor, and trade. Plantation owners, merchants, and settlers came to understand that the law supported contracts and property claims. In North America, local councils resolved disagreements over boundaries, resources, and trade routes. In India, English law intersected with local customs, creating hybrid systems that allowed British authority to function while accommodating certain practices. In all places, law became a tool of organization, communication, and control. The influence of these early legal systems extended beyond formal proceedings. Settlers adapted to regulations in their daily lives. Commercial contracts were upheld. Decisions of local councils shaped town planning, taxation, and labor expectations. The rules became part of the social fabric. Compliance was not only a legal requirement. It became a habit. Settlers internalized the principles of authority, learning to navigate the empire's expectations before they ever left their communities. Education also reinforced legal understanding. Missionaries and teachers introduced literacy and numeracy alongside instruction in civic and moral responsibility. Children learned the importance of contracts, agreements, and ethical conduct. They grew up seeing the connection between obedience to law and participation in society. Early instruction prepared the next generation to function within systems that were simultaneously local and imperial. Knowledge of law became both skill and socialization. As the century progressed, records and precedents accumulated. Council minutes, court decisions, and charters created a repository of knowledge that future administrators could reference. Patterns of governance became standardized. Authority was codified, documented, and consistent. The early foundation set a model for expansion, demonstrating that control could be maintained through regulation as much as through force. These foundations shaped identity as well. Colonists came to see themselves as part of a legal and civic community aligned with British principles. Rights, responsibilities, and obligations became a shared language. Even in distant lands, participation in councils and courts connected settlers to the wider imperial system. Law taught that the empire was not only present, but predictable and comprehensible. Compliance became a marker of belonging. By the end of the 17th century, the first classrooms, councils, and courts had created a network of influence. Small in scale, modest in construction, and experimental in approach. These systems nevertheless carried authority across oceans. They established expectations, shaped behavior, and laid the groundwork for governance in centuries to come. The lessons learned in these early settlements demonstrated that law could travel farther than ships, more quietly than armies, and endure longer than charters, and lay the groundwork for governance in centuries to come. The story of colonial law between 1600 and 1700 is a story of beginnings. It is a story of modest structures that carried powerful authority. It is a story of councils and courts that taught settlers how to live under rules from afar. It is a story of law as both guide and instrument, shaping communities, commerce, and identity. The first legal systems were small, but their influence grew, establishing the foundation for centuries of imperial administration and the quiet authority of the crown across distant lands. Between 1650 and 1750, the Caribbean became a place where law and labor intertwined to shape daily life. British legal frameworks spread across islands where plantations had become the backbone of the economy. Courts and regulations were established to define property, govern trade, and control labor. Plantation owners relied on these laws to secure wealth, ensure predictability, and maintain order. The legal system operated in tandem with the social and economic structures of the colonies, creating a hierarchy that reinforced authority at every level. Property law became central to this system. Land ownership was formally recorded, with boundaries drawn, and disputes settled in colonial courts. Plantation estates were documented carefully, and the law recognized their value. Ownership of land translated into authority over labor and production. Courts upheld these rights, ensuring that estate boundaries were respected, and that challenges could be addressed legally. The legal system offered protection and legitimacy, guaranteeing that the structures they built were recognized as assets of the empire. Labor regulations reflected the priorities of plantation owners. Laws defined the roles and responsibilities of enslaved people, setting rules for work, punishment, and daily life. These laws were designed to preserve productivity and minimize disruption. Enforcement was strict, with penalties for defiance clearly stated. Courts frequently acted in favor of planters, interpreting statutes to maintain the order necessary for economic success. The legal system became a tool for controlling human activity, turning compliance into a matter of both moral and material consequence. Trade and commerce were equally regulated. British law established the rules for shipping, tariffs, and market activity. Merchants and plantation owners relied on legal protections to ensure that goods moved predictably between ports, both within the Caribbean and across the Atlantic. Contracts were enforced, disputes resolved, and commercial networks maintained under the authority of colonial courts. The law structured economic life, aligning local activity with imperial expectations. Order in trade mirrored order in production, creating a coherent system across the islands. For enslaved populations and local communities, access to legal rights was limited. Courts were primarily instruments of authority rather than instruments of justice. Cases brought by enslaved people were rare, and their voices often went unheard. Legal representation was scarce, and outcomes typically favored those who held power. The law reinforced the hierarchy that existed in everyday life. Access to justice was determined not by equity but by social and economic position. Authority and compliance were inseparable in this context. The courts themselves became symbols of imperial power. Judges and magistrates presided over cases with the authority of the crown, interpreting statutes and issuing verdicts that shaped social behavior. Legal proceedings were formal, ritualized, and public. Decisions were recorded and archived, providing precedents that guided future cases. The presence of courts reminded everyone that the empire's reach extended beyond trade and military presence. Law was a constant, visible force that legitimized authority and disciplined society. Hierarchy was enforced not only through the content of laws, but through the process of administration. Legal knowledge was concentrated in the hands of officials and professionals trained in British systems. Plantation owners and colonial administrators understood the rules. Those at the bottom of the hierarchy were subject to them. Obedience was measured not only in daily behavior but in adherence to legal expectations. The law structured interaction, controlled mobility, and defined the limits of permissible action. Education and literacy reinforced the legal system. Documents, contracts, and court records required comprehension. And those who could read and write gained advantage. Clerks, surveyors, and accountants became essential to maintaining records. Knowledge of law became a form of power. The ability to interpret statutes or reference precedents distinguished those who could operate within the system from those who could not. Literacy and law together created a framework that extended imperial control into every corner of society. Resistance existed, though it took subtle forms. Enslaved people and local communities often found ways to navigate around restrictions. They adapted work patterns, negotiated conditions, or appealed in ways that did not challenge authority directly. Cultural practices continued alongside legal frameworks, creating spaces where life existed beyond strict oversight. Still, the courts maintained ultimate authority, and those who transgressed without recognized recourse faced consequences. By 1750, the Caribbean legal system had become deeply embedded in the structures of empire. Property, labor, and trade were codified. Courts enforced hierarchy and offered predictability for those in power. The law shaped the daily rhythms of work, commerce, and interaction. Authority was legitimized, maintained, and made visible through legal mechanisms. Compliance was expected, and social structures were reinforced through statute and precedent. The legacy of this period shows how law functioned as both instrument and symbol. It provided order, secured economic interests, and enforced hierarchy. It offered protection for those with power, while limiting the options of those without. Law and empire were inseparable. Courts, statutes, and regulations became the backbone of authority in the Caribbean. They ensured that the structure of plantation society aligned with imperial priorities, making obedience not only practical but codified. Plantations, ports, and towns operated under rules that favored the elite. Law became a mechanism through which empire asserted control, shaping daily life and securing the structures that underpinned wealth and power. India and the Company Courts 1757 to 1858. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company gained control over Bengal. With victory came not only territory, but the responsibility of governing millions of people. To manage trade, property, and civil disputes, officials established courts. These courts became the backbone of administration, allowing the company to exercise authority far beyond what soldiers alone could achieve. At first, the courts focused on commercial matters. Disputes over land and property required a clear structure. Officials blended English law with Indian customs to create a hybrid system. This hybrid system was a success, paving the way for future growth. As the system developed, courts spread across India. By the early 1800s, they could be found in major cities and provincial towns. Each court became a center of authority, staffed by officials trained in English legal principles and local regulations. Judges, clerks, and interpreters applied rules that combined written codes with familiar customs. The approach allowed the company to enforce decisions effectively while maintaining a degree of local legitimacy. Legal authority became a tool of administration as well as justice. Decisions in court affected taxation, trade, and land management. Courts provided a mechanism for resolving disputes that might otherwise lead to unrest. They allowed the company to maintain order without relying solely on military presence. Law became a subtle form of governance, guiding behavior, regulating commerce, and reinforcing the authority of officials. In Bengal, Calcutta became the headquarters for the company's judicial system. The Supreme Court handled cases involving Europeans, while subordinate courts addressed local disputes. Over time, similar structures emerged in Madras and Bombay. Each court operated within the hybrid legal framework, applying English procedures to Indian contexts. Local languages were often used alongside English to communicate judgments and facilitate participation. Local languages were often used alongside English to communicate judgments and facilitate participation. Company courts also shaped social relations. Land disputes, inheritance cases, and commercial claims were resolved according to rules designed to balance English legal concepts with traditional practices. People learned to navigate the system. Lawyers and clerks trained in these courts became intermediaries, capable of interpreting and enforcing decisions. The courts produced a class of professionals whose authority derived from knowledge rather than arms. Education and the legal system intersected. Schools trained clerks and interpreters who could support court administration. Students learned English, arithmetic, and record-keeping. They acquired the skills needed to work within the legal network, translating law into action. Through education, the company extended its reach, creating a network of personnel capable of sustaining governance over vast distances. By the 1820s, the company courts had expanded into a comprehensive judicial network. Civil, commercial, and revenue disputes were handled with increasing consistency. Judges interpreted regulations, applied precedents, and maintained records. Their decisions affected trade, land tenure, and civil relations across the subcontinent. The system reduced the need for constant military intervention and allowed the company to manage a growing empire with fewer resources. The courts also introduced new ideas about rights, obligations, and property. They codified aspects of law that had previously been fluid, creating reference points for administration and reform. While the hybrid approach respected some local customs, it also imposed new standards. Individuals learned to present claims according to procedural rules. Disputes were formalized, and resolution became dependent on adherence to both English and Indian norms. This legal network had long-term consequences. It trained a generation of Indian professionals familiar with English law, procedures, and administrative practices. Graduates of law schools and clerical programs could operate within the imperial system, yet their knowledge also equipped them to critique it. Over time, these professionals became voices for reform, articulating concerns using the very frameworks that had once enforced authority. Over time, these professionals became voices for reform, articulating concerns using the very frameworks that had once enforced authority. The East India Company relied on the courts not only to settle disputes, but to legitimize its rule. Legal authority provided a veneer of fairness, presenting governance as orderly and rational. Decisions were written, documented, and repeatable. The courts created predictability, and predictability reinforced control. Administration and justice became intertwined, allowing the empire to govern effectively while maintaining an appearance of impartiality. By 1858, the Campania's court system had matured into a complex and extensive network. It reached into villages and cities, influencing daily life through decisions on trade, property, and civil matters. The system enabled Britain to manage a diverse population across a vast territory, using law as both a practical and symbolic instrument of authority. Legal structures, clerks, and interpreters became essential components of governance, extending imperial power far beyond military capability. Company law allowed Britain to govern millions with fewer soldiers. Courts blended English principles with local practices. Legal authority became administration as well as justice. Education, language, and judicial networks created a system capable of sustaining rule. The East India Campania's courts transformed governance, creating order, stability, and a framework that would influence India long after 1858. African colonies and customary law between 1800 and 1900 reveal a landscape of negotiation, adaptation, and tension. When Britain extended its authority inland, administrators encountered legal systems that had developed over generations. Chiefs, councils, and local courts had long governed disputes, defined property, and regulated trade according to customs that were familiar and meaningful to communities. These systems were deeply rooted, reflecting social hierarchies, family networks, and regional practices. Colonial officials arrived with the intention of managing territory efficiently, but they quickly faced the complexity of law that was not theirs. In many colonies, administrators sought to maintain order by retaining local chiefs and customary courts. This approach created continuity and legitimacy. Chiefs adjudicated disputes, oversaw rituals of justice, and applied rules familiar to the people. Their authority provided a bridge between the empire and the communities it governed. At the same time, British law was overlaid across the colonies. Criminal codes, trade regulations, and property rights were standardized according to principles drawn from England. Officials introduced courts, judges, and procedural rules that often felt foreign and abstract. The overlay of English law disrupted the balance. Practices that had been settled by negotiation, mediation, and community consensus were now subject to documentation, evidence, and formal judgment. A property dispute once resolved by elders could be appealed to a colonial court, where legal reasoning relied on precedent and statute rather than custom. Trade agreements once conducted by handshake and local authority now required written contracts enforced by colonial officers. The familiar rhythms of community law were disrupted, even when chiefs remained in place as intermediaries. In this context, law became both a bridge and a barrier. It bridged the gap by providing channels through which British administrators could govern distant communities with a sense of order. Chiefs and local courts acted as interpreters, translating customary practice into forms acceptable to colonial oversight. Yet law also became a barrier. Rules, processes, and expectations unfamiliar to local populations made justice feel distant and opaque. Penalties enforced according to English codes could seem arbitrary. Decisions made in courts far from villages often contradicted local norms and values. Disputes over land illustrate this dynamic clearly. African communities understood land as both economic resource and social inheritance. Use, access, and stewardship were determined by family lineage, agreements between neighboring villages, and customary obligations. English property law emphasized individual ownership, titles, and formal registration. When the two systems intersected, confusion and conflict emerged. Authority shifted, and the meaning of land changed alongside it. Trade and commerce also felt the impact. Local markets had operated on customary understandings of obligation, trust, and negotiation. Traders and merchants had to navigate the expectations of both customary practice and colonial enforcement. The result was a dual system in which compliance was partial, adaptation was necessary, and tensions between the two worlds persisted. Success required knowledge of rules that were sometimes contradictory, and mastery of both local and foreign codes. The imposition of English law also extended to criminal justice. Crimes defined and punished according to local custom were reframed under colonial codes. Practices of mediation or compensation were replaced with imprisonment, fines, or corporal punishment administered in colonial courts. Chiefs often struggled to reconcile their traditional authority with these new procedures. Communities learned that customary expectations no longer guaranteed resolution, and the sense of fairness that had guided law for generations was sometimes replaced by the authority of the colonial state. Over time, this dual system created both adaptation and resistance. Chiefs and administrators experimented with compromise, seeking ways to maintain legitimacy while implementing colonial policies. Communities adapted by learning which customs were respected, which were overruled, and which required negotiation. Some elders sought to document customary laws, translating them into formats that colonial courts could recognize. Others resisted formalization, preserving oral traditions and local judgment practices despite official pressure. By the late 19th century, the overlay of English law was firmly established. Yet it existed in constant dialogue with customary systems. Legal pluralism became a defining feature of African colonies. Chiefs, local courts, and colonial judges operated in parallel, shaping the lives of communities in ways both complementary and contradictory. Understanding, compliance, and conflict intertwined, creating a landscape of law that was as dynamic as the societies it governed. In African colonies between 1800 and 1900, law served as a tool, a bridge, and a source of tension. Customary authority provided continuity and legitimacy. English law standardized, codified, and extended imperial control. Together, the two systems structured daily life, guided dispute resolution, and mediated the relationship between colonized peoples and colonial officials. They shaped perceptions of justice, fairness, and authority, influencing identity and governance across generations. The result was a complex legal environment in which power, tradition, and procedure intersected. Law became more than rules, it became a reflection of negotiation between worlds, a marker of continuity and change, and a force that reshaped societies from the village to the colonial capital. Disputes, resolutions, and enforcement during this period reveal how empire managed diversity while asserting authority, and how communities navigated, adapted to, and sometimes resisted that authority. In this century, African colonies learned that law could open doors and impose limits. It could translate custom into governance, but it could also alienate and confuse. Chiefs, elders, and colonial officers all participated in this system. Law was both bridge and barrier, leaving a legacy that would continue to influence African societies well beyond 1900. North America and legal foundation 1700 to 1776 begins in the bustling towns, ports, and rural settlements of the British colonies. Law was everywhere. It governed trade along the Atlantic coast, regulated property, and structured the relationships between neighbors. British legal principles determined who could own land, how contracts were enforced, and how taxes were collected. Courthouses became central to civic life, their steps and chambers filled with litigants, witnesses, and officials. Authority arrived not only in proclamations but in practice, shaping daily routines and expectations. By the early 18th century, legal administration had expanded alongside settlement. County courts, magistrates, and colonial governors exercised authority rooted in British precedent. Land deeds were recorded and disputed. Business agreements were adjudicated, and fines or penalties reinforced compliance. Merchants relied on law to protect contracts across ports in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Farmers looked to courts to resolve disputes over boundaries, leases, or inheritance. Law structured life as surely as the seasons or the tide. Trade depended on legal clarity. Shipping licenses, tariffs, and customs regulations ensured that commerce operated according to established rules. Ports thrived when merchants understood their rights and obligations. Ships sailed with insurance policies and documents that traced ownership. Courts adjudicated conflicts when shipments were lost, stolen, or misdelivered. Legal certainty made colonial markets predictable and prosperous, reinforcing British control while allowing commerce to flourish. Yet law also created tension. Colonial assemblies, courts, and governors sometimes imposed regulations that felt distant or arbitrary to residents. Taxes levied to fund imperial projects, regulations on trade, and limits on local authority stirred resentment. Taxes levied to fund imperial projects, regulations on trade, and limits on local authority stirred resentment. Taxes levied to fund imperial projects, regulations on trade, and limits on local authority stirred resentment. Disputes were not rare. They were woven into the fabric of colonial life, affecting families, businesses, and communities alike. Disputes were not rare. They were woven into the fabric of colonial life, affecting families, businesses, and communities alike. By the mid-1700s, legal disputes became more common as colonies expanded and populations grew. Settlement moved into new territories. Boundaries were unclear. Land claims overlapped. Farmers, merchants, and indigenous communities encountered conflicts that courts were expected to resolve. British authority extended into every settlement, yet its reach sometimes felt distant or uneven. The law was present, but not always impartial, and its consequences shaped perceptions of justice and fairness. Legal principles were taught alongside civic duty. Property rights, contracts, and obligations were conveyed not only through formal courts but also in community discussion, town meetings, and local custom. Knowledge of the law became essential to participation in economic and social life. Residents learned how to navigate regulations, appeal decisions, and protect their interests. Legal literacy was as much a survival skill as an intellectual exercise, giving shape to personal, communal, and economic choices. The American Revolution illustrated the dual nature of law as both stabilizing and contentious. British legal authority had created a framework for order. But it also created expectations that were not always met. Colonists reacted not against law itself, but against what they perceived as unfair or imposed rules. Taxes on tea, stamps, and other goods were seen as legal instruments that overstepped local consent. Courts that enforced these rules became symbols of distant control rather than impartial justice. Discontent grew alongside the system that had once provided stability. Resistance took many forms. Pamphlets, petitions, and assemblies challenged perceived abuses. Public protests and boycotts demonstrated that knowledge of the law could be used to contest authority. Individuals who understood property rights, contractual obligations, and governance structures leveraged them to argue against policies imposed from London. The same legal system that underpinned order became a tool for organized challenge. Law shaped both loyalty and defiance. The American Revolution also showed how legal ideas could travel and transform. Colonists drew upon British legal principles while arguing for representation and rights. Concepts of trial by jury, habeas corpus, and protection of property were invoked to justify dissent. Law was not abandoned. It was repurposed, reframed, and claimed as a foundation for independence. Authority was questioned, but the vocabulary and logic of British law continued to guide political argument. Courts and legal institutions themselves were affected by conflict. Some were abandoned during unrest. Others became contested spaces where loyalty, resistance, and governance intersected. Judges, clerks, and lawyers navigated changing allegiances. They mediated between imperial command and local expectation. The administration of law reflected the tension between control and consent, between order and rebellion. Every case carried weight beyond its immediate outcome, shaping perceptions of legitimacy. By 1776, North America had experienced decades of legal development under British authority. Courts, statutes, and customs shaped the colony's economy, governance, and society. Knowledge of the law defined participation, opportunity, and rights. Yet these systems also sowed seeds of dispute, dissatisfaction, and ultimately revolution. The legal framework established between 1700 and 1776 created a world where authority and accountability were intertwined. British law provided order, predictability, and protection. But it also enforced hierarchy, centralized control, and distant oversight. It shaped thought as much as behavior, teaching residents to understand and navigate power. Law became both a stabilizing force and a catalyst for change. North American courts, land registries, and colonial statutes left a legacy that would continue beyond revolution. Legal reasoning, record-keeping, and procedural standards survived and adapted in new governments. Knowledge of law became essential not only for colonial administration but for the construction of independent governance. The American experience demonstrated that law is never neutral. It carries influence, shapes expectation, and frames both obedience and dissent. In the end, British law in North America was more than a set of rules. It was a structure that defined trade, property, and daily life. It was a framework that enabled both prosperity and protest. Courts enforced contracts and taxes, yet they also taught communities how to understand authority. The American Revolution revealed that law could unify, guide, and stabilize, but it could also provoke resistance when perceived as unfair. The story of British legal foundations shows that authority and legitimacy are built as much in the minds of the governed as in the text of statutes. Education and legal training 1800 to 1900. The story begins in classrooms far from the territories they would serve. In the 19th century, British law was no longer confined to courtrooms. It entered lecture halls, study rooms, and examination centers designed to prepare young administrators for service across the empire. Clerks, lawyers, and judges studied English legal principles not as abstract theory, but as practical tools they would use in distant lands. Education became the bridge between knowledge and authority, shaping the people who carried the empire's influence abroad. Young men arrived at schools with notebooks, textbooks, and pens, ready to learn the foundations of law that governed Britain at home. Their lessons covered statutes, case law, and principles of equity. They studied contracts, property rights, criminal codes, and procedural norms. Each concept was presented with the expectation that it would travel thousands of miles and remain effective in diverse contexts. These students were the empire's first line of legal continuity, trained to ensure order wherever they were posted. Textbooks became central to instruction. Pages illustrated procedures, listed precedents, and explained legal reasoning. Diagrams of court hierarchies, procedural flows, and administrative chains helped students visualize authority. Exercises and hypothetical cases challenged them to apply principles to practical scenarios. Repetition, memorization, and written examinations tested not only knowledge, but comprehension, judgment, and alignment with British norms. Mastery of these materials meant mastery of the empire's expectations. Lectures reinforced the written word. Experienced officials and legal scholars explained the subtleties of British law, offering guidance on applying it overseas. They addressed questions about local adaptation, interpreting customs, and handling conflicts. Students learned that law was not only rules, but a framework for navigating power. They discovered that decisions would shape societies, influence commerce, and affect daily life. Education thus became an instrument for teaching authority itself. Examinations formalized this preparation. Success meant eligibility for posts abroad. Failure limited opportunity. Standards were rigorous, ensuring that those who carried authority were capable, confident, and aligned with imperial expectations. A young clerk passing a test in London might soon serve in India or the Caribbean, interpreting contracts, adjudicating disputes, and administering justice according to principles learned thousands of miles from the place of application. Uniformity was essential to the empire's cohesion. This system created consistency across continents. Courts in India followed procedures similar to those in Africa. Administrators enforced rules with predictable outcomes. Contracts written in the Caribbean resembled those in Southeast Asia. The legal training ensured that the empire spoke with a single voice. Knowledge became the vehicle for authority, and authority traveled with the trained mind. Education also shaped identity and loyalty. Students learned to see British law as legitimate, rational, and universal. They internalized a worldview in which the empire's presence was natural, expected, and justified. Legal knowledge was not neutral. It reinforced hierarchy, cemented governance, and aligned administrators with imperial goals. Those who mastered the system gained opportunity and influence, while the framework itself ensured that British norms remained dominant. Practical exercises connected theory to administration. Students wrote model judgments, analyzed disputes, and debated outcomes. They simulated courtrooms, exploring how statutes might apply in unfamiliar contexts. They considered local customs, colonial economies, and social structures, learning when adaptation was necessary and when consistency must prevail. Education became both preparation and subtle training in governance, teaching discretion within the boundaries of authority. Mission schools and other educational institutions reinforced this system. Literacy, numeracy, and comprehension provided the foundation for legal training. Students who had studied in mission schools or local academies could now apply knowledge to the administration of law. Education and legal training intertwined, producing a cadre of officials capable of interpreting, enforcing, and explaining the empire's rules across continents. By the late 19th century, this process had created a network of trained administrators. Clerks in offices, judges in courts, and legal advisors in councils all shared a common foundation. They communicated with a consistent vocabulary, applied procedures in predictable ways, and reinforced the legitimacy of imperial law. The empire's authority was strengthened not only by force or trade, but by the disciplined minds of those who carried its principles into distant lands. The influence of education extended beyond immediate administration. Students trained in law influenced local practices, advised leaders, and interpreted disputes in ways that shaped communities. Knowledge became power, and power was exercised through the trained application of principles learned in classrooms far from the territories they would govern. The empire extended not only physically, but intellectually. This system demonstrated that governance required more than presence. Authority depended on preparation, uniformity, and understanding. By teaching English law to future administrators, Britain ensured that imperial objectives were preserved across oceans and continents. Education became both shield and instrument, allowing distant officials to act with confidence and legitimacy. Foundations of consistency, authority, and loyalty were laid in these classrooms. Textbooks, lectures, and examinations created not only knowledge, but a shared framework for interpreting and applying power. The empire could operate reliably because those who carried its principles were trained, tested, and aligned. Education and legal training became inseparable from administration, forming the backbone of governance across the British Empire. Between 1850 and 1914, the British Empire undertook a significant effort to codify law across its colonies. Legal reform became a central strategy for governance, aiming to create uniformity, predictability, and control. Criminal codes, property regulations, and civil laws were written down in English, replacing unwritten customs and traditional practices. Courts were given final authority to interpret and enforce these statutes, ensuring that local disputes, trade arrangements, and administrative matters were aligned with imperial priorities. The act of codification transformed how societies were governed, standardizing authority and reinforcing the reach of empire. In many colonies, codified law replaced systems that had existed for generations. Local customs, informal dispute resolution, and community norms were recorded, rewritten, or overridden. Indigenous and regional practices were often marginalized or reinterpreted through the lens of British legal reasoning. The courts became instruments of imperial authority, their decisions serving as precedents to guide future governance. This created a legal environment where the stadia's interpretation held final weight, and local traditions were subordinated to written statutes. Criminal law became an area of particular focus. Codes defined offenses, punishments, and procedures, establishing clear expectations for behavior. Courts prosecuted crimes according to written statutes rather than customary practices. This reinforced the presence of power while creating a uniform understanding of justice across diverse territories. Property law was another cornerstone of codification. Land ownership, leases, inheritance, and dispute resolution were defined with precision. Boundaries were surveyed and recorded. Documentation became essential, and courts adjudicated disputes using formal records. Property law served not only economic purposes but also social ones. It clarified rights for those recognized by the system and limited claims from those who were not. Land that had been subject to customary regulation now fell under statutory authority, aligning economic control with imperial governance. Civil regulations extended beyond property and criminal law. Trade, taxation, and administrative procedures were standardized, ensuring that commerce flowed predictably and revenue was collected efficiently. Licenses, permits, and records of transactions were enforced according to written rules. The codified system enabled the empire to manage resources, maintain order, and monitor economic activity with greater ease. Officials could track compliance and enforce regulations with authority backed by the written word rather than tradition or negotiation. Codification also extended to public administration. Laws defined the responsibilities of officials, the processes for managing local governance, and the relationship between the state and subjects. Administrative reform ensured that officials operated under clear legal guidance, reducing ambiguity and increasing efficiency. Standardized procedures meant that decisions in one part of a colony could be reproduced elsewhere, creating predictability and strengthening central oversight. The empire relied on this consistency to maintain control across vast and diverse territories, while codification made governance easier for colonial authorities. It often came at the expense of local traditions. Communities accustomed to resolving disputes through informal or customary methods found themselves subject to unfamiliar procedures and expectations. The authority of elders, councils, and customary law diminished as British statutes became dominant. This shift reshaped social structures and altered how people navigated justice, property, and administration. Codified law centralized power and diminished the flexibility that had allowed local communities to manage their own affairs. Education, documentation, and literacy became increasingly important under the codified system. Clerks, administrators, and legal professionals needed to understand the codes, apply them correctly, and maintain records. Knowledge of English became a prerequisite for participation in official processes. Literacy and familiarity with law determined access to rights, economic opportunities, and positions of influence. Those who could navigate the legal system gained advantage, while those who could not were excluded or marginalized. Resistance and adaptation emerged alongside codification. Some communities sought to preserve customs alongside statutory law, interpreting regulations in ways that maintained continuity with tradition. Others attempted to bypass formal processes, relying on informal agreements or local knowledge to navigate the system. Codification introduced both structure and tension. As the formal authority of law encountered the lived realities of people accustomed to customary governance. By 1914, the codification of law had transformed colonial governance across the British Empire. Written statutes provided clarity, uniformity, and authority. Courts and officials operated within a defined framework, creating predictability for administration, commerce, and social regulation. At the same time, local traditions were diminished, reshaped, or subordinated, and the power to define justice and property rested firmly with the empire. Codified law became a central tool for controlling diverse territories, ensuring that the structures of power and hierarchy were maintained systematically. Between 1850 and 1914, legal reform and codification revealed both the strength and limits of imperial authority. Laws standardized governance, enforced hierarchy, and facilitated control. They opened new pathways for administration, trade, and regulation. Yet they also reshaped societies, constrained local traditions, and determined who could access rights and influence. The codified legal system became a mechanism through which empire extended its reach, shaping everyday life, social structures, and the exercise of power across vast colonial territories. Resistance and adaptation 1900 to 1945. Between 1900 and 1945, the reach of British law extended across India, Africa, and the Caribbean. Courts, regulations, and administrators attempted to impose order, manage disputes, and maintain authority over vast and diverse populations. The legal system was designed to codify governance, regulate commerce, and provide predictability. Yet even as its influence grew, resistance persisted, adapting to the structures imposed by empire. Local leaders found ways to challenge authority without direct confrontation. Village chiefs, tribal elders, and community representatives appealed to customary norms when imperial law conflicted with tradition. Disputes over land, inheritance, or taxation sometimes bypassed colonial courts, resolved instead through negotiation or local council decisions. Legal authority was significant, but it was not absolute. Those who knew both systems could navigate between them to protect their communities. In India, independence movements began to challenge the legitimacy of colonial law more openly. Lawyers, politicians, and activists used knowledge of British legal systems to argue for rights, representation, and reform. Petitions, public debates, and legislative campaigns became tools for advocacy. The very skills taught within colonial courts of reasoning, interpretation, and rhetorica were repurposed to question the system itself. Education and law, intended to secure compliance, became instruments of challenge. In Africa, local populations similarly resisted through adaptation. Chiefs and councils negotiated compromises with colonial authorities, sometimes accepting partial rulings while maintaining local governance practices. Customary law persisted alongside imperial regulations, creating a dual system where both could operate. Courts recognized the practicality of compromise, understanding that rigid enforcement could provoke unrest. Resistance was often subtle, embedded in everyday decisions and interactions with administrators. The Caribbean presented another layer of complexity. Used education, literacy, and local institutions to interpret colonial law. And social grievances were addressed both in courts and through collective negotiation. Educated leaders acted as intermediaries, translating regulations and advocating for rights, ensuring that local priorities were considered alongside imperial directives. Colonial authorities, recognizing the limits of strict enforcement, began to adapt. Legal codes were modified to incorporate customary practices where possible. Courts adjusted procedures to accommodate local contexts, allowing for compromise without abandoning the appearance of control. Administrators learned to balance imperial goals with the realities of daily life, creating a system that was flexible, yet still hierarchical. Adaptation became a necessity for maintaining stability. Throughout these decades, resistance and adaptation were intertwined. They learned its boundaries, understood its applications, and discovered ways to work within it while protecting their communities. Negotiation became a form of agency, and knowledge of the system empowered local leaders to influence outcomes. Resistance was both practical and strategic, demonstrating resilience and understanding. Education continued to play a critical role in shaping responses. Students trained in English and law acquired the skills to interpret statutes, present arguments, and advocate effectively. Mission schools, universities, and legal training programs produced graduates capable of navigating both imperial and local systems. Literacy and familiarity with procedures allowed populations to question, negotiate, and adapt, transforming education into a tool of empowerment. By the 1930s, independence movements had grown in scale and complexity. Leaders drew on experience with law and governance to mobilize communities, organize petitions, and articulate demands. The duality of resistance and adaptation became evident in strategies that combined compliance with selective challenge. Imperial authority persisted, but it was increasingly contested both intellectually and practically. World events further influenced the balance between law and resistance. Global conflicts, economic pressures, and political shifts highlighted the fragility of rigid legal control. Colonial administrations recognized that enforcement without negotiation could provoke instability. Legal frameworks became more responsive, if still constrained by the priorities of empire. The process of adaptation reflected an evolving understanding of governance under pressure. Authority remained, but it was shaped by interactions with those it governed. Courts continued to function, but they operated alongside customary practices, local leadership, and organized advocacy. Despite British law's reach, resistance persisted. Independence movements challenged legal authority in India, Africa, and the Caribbean. Colonial law began to adapt, balancing imperial goals with local realities. The classroom, the council, and the court became sites of negotiation, strategy, and resilience. Through resistance and adaptation, populations exercised agency within an empire that sought to define the rules. And by the mid-20th century, those lessons of negotiation, persistence, and legal knowledge would become part of the foundation for movements that reshaped nations. Transition to independence between 1945 and 1970 marks a profound shift in the global order. After the devastation of World War II, Britain begins a gradual process of granting sovereignty to colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The empire contracts, yet its influence does not disappear overnight. New nations emerge, carrying both the promise of self-determination and the structures inherited from centuries of British administration. Among the most enduring of these legacies is law, which outlives political authority and continues to shape governance long after independence is declared. In 1947, India becomes independent. The flag changes. Governments are formed. Judges trained in colonial traditions continue to serve. Lawyers educated in English law navigate a system designed for order and predictability. The inherited legal framework provides stability in a moment of dramatic change, even as it adapts to reflect national priorities. Across Africa, the process unfolds in a similar pattern. Ghana gains independence in 1957. Nigeria follows in 1960. Each new nation faces the challenge of building identity and sovereignty while retaining the procedural tools necessary for governance. British legal structures, including criminal and civil codes, property law, and administrative procedures, provide a framework that is functional and familiar. They offer continuity in an era of transition, yet also carry the imprint of a foreign system. Legal continuity serves multiple purposes. It ensures that courts can function immediately after independence, preventing chaos in civil and criminal matters. It facilitates trade, as businesses and citizens rely on established contracts and property rights. It provides a foundation for legislation, allowing new governments to draft laws that are coherent, enforceable, and consistent with prior practice. At the same time, it reminds citizens and officials alike that independence is not a clean break, it is a transition built upon inherited systems. New nations also adapt these legal frameworks. Codified statutes are amended to reflect local priorities, cultural values, and the realities of governance in post-colonial contexts. Customary practices are integrated alongside statutory law. Courts develop procedures that accommodate local languages and legal traditions. Judges and lawyers reinterpret inherited codes to serve citizens rather than the colonial administration. The legal system becomes both familiar and newly national, bridging past and present. The persistence of British legal influence shapes society beyond the courtroom. Property rights, trade regulations, and administrative rules maintain order, but also influence social norms. Citizens understand that law is a tool for organization, a standard for dispute resolution, and a mechanism for fairness as defined by centuries of British precedent. Education in legal principles continues in universities, training a generation of professionals who can operate in both inherited frameworks and emerging national systems. Political leaders recognize the utility and limitations of inherited law. They rely on its stability while acknowledging that it must evolve to reflect independence. Legislatures create new statutes, sometimes retaining the language and structure of colonial codes while modifying content to match local realities. Judicial independence grows in importance, and courts begin to assert authority as impartial arbiters rather than extensions of foreign rule. The legal system becomes a site where sovereignty is exercised in practical terms. Across regions, citizens experience the law in ways that blend continuity and change. Cases are heard in familiar settings, with procedures reminiscent of colonial practice. Yet the outcomes increasingly reflect national priorities. Individuals navigate property transactions, trade agreements, and personal disputes with knowledge of both inherited rules and evolving standards. Law becomes a bridge connecting the stability of the past with the demands of independence. By the late 1960s, the process of transition is evident. Nations operate legal systems that are both functional and national. British influence remains visible in courtrooms, legal texts, and professional practice. But local interpretation and innovation dominate daily operation. Citizens, officials, and lawyers participate in a system that owes its origins to empire, yet serves an independent population. Law demonstrates the continuity of structure even amid political transformation. The survival of legal frameworks illustrates a broader theme of post-colonial transition. Independence is not instantaneous in its effects. Systems endure. Education, administration, and law retain forms inherited from colonial governance. These structures provide tools necessary for stability, while accommodating the creativity and priorities of new nations. The empire may have ended, but its architecture persists, guiding the practical exercise of authority. Between 1945 and 1970, the transition to independence. Countries build sovereignty on inherited legal systems, while asserting identity through adaptation. Courts, codes, and procedures outlive imperial rule, influencing governance, society, and national development. Law becomes a thread linking centuries of administration to the aspirations of new nations. A reminder that independence is both a break and a continuation. The story of post-colonial legal survival is a story of balance. Nations navigate inherited structures, reform them to reflect local priorities, and use them to exercise authority. Judges, lawyers, and legislators shape governance while maintaining order. Citizens experience continuity and change simultaneously. The law, more than flags or proclamations, survives as one of the most enduring legacies of empire, structuring modern governance in ways that continue to influence Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean long after 1970. Legacy of British law today begins in courtrooms across the world, from Canada to Kenya, from India to Australia, where English common law continues to shape the practice of justice. Property rights, contracts, criminal codes, and court procedures in former colonies often mirror the structures introduced centuries ago. Legal systems operate within frameworks built to maintain order, provide predictability, and standardize governance. For many, these inherited rules create stability in societies that have grown complex, interconnected, and diverse. British law was more than rules on paper. It was an instrument of empire, designed to organize territories, regulate commerce, and establish authority. Its influence extended beyond legislation. It shaped social expectations, economic behavior, and the relationships between rulers and the ruled. Colonial administrators relied on these systems to control distant populations, resolve disputes, and enforce compliance. Courts and legal processes became central to life, touching trade, property, and even family arrangements, and influencing the lives of all. The legacy of British law is visible in the form and function of courts. Judges wear robes, follow procedures, and make decisions according to precedents established in Britain. Hearings proceed according to codified rules, evidence is weighed systematically, and appeals follow structured paths. These practices provide a sense of consistency. They allow participants to understand the steps required to navigate justice. For many societies, this predictability has been invaluable, allowing law to mediate conflicts, protect rights, and facilitate trade. Property law remains one of the clearest examples of British influence. Land deeds, leases, and inheritance rules reflect the structures introduced during colonial administration. Titles are recorded, boundaries documented, and ownership verified through legal instruments rooted in common law. Contracts follow similar logic, emphasizing written agreements, enforceable obligations, and remedies in case of breach. These frameworks provide security for business, agriculture, and urban development, creating the foundation for economic growth. Offenses are defined, penalties prescribed, and trials conducted according to standardized principles. That defendants have opportunities to respond, and that judgments are documented for reference. The core logic of British common law remains, providing continuity in how societies approach justice. Yet this legacy is not without tension. For some, British legal systems replaced local traditions, customary laws, and indigenous dispute resolution methods. Rules once developed within communities were sometimes set aside in favor of foreign structures. Authority that had been understood and negotiated locally was replaced by distant standards. Legal literacy became necessary not only to understand rights, but also to navigate a system designed for those who held power. The imposition of these structures could disrupt social norms, traditions, and cultural expectations. Education in law, too, followed British patterns. Universities, legal schools, and professional training emphasized reasoning, precedent, and codified statutes. Lawyers learned to argue within these frameworks, judges applied principles rooted in centuries-old cases. And legal documents followed formal styles introduced by the empire. Knowledge of the system became both a tool and a gatekeeper, allowing those trained in its logic to participate fully in governance, business, and civic life. Despite these challenges, many societies adapted the inherited legal structures. Countries integrated local customs, interpreted codes to reflect contemporary values, and reformed procedures to meet modern needs. The legacy of British law proved flexible, capable of evolving even as it maintained continuity. Legislatures amended statutes, courts established new precedents, and educational institutions trained professionals who could reconcile historical frameworks with present realities. For some, the influence of British law is a benefit. It provides clarity, stability, and frameworks that enable complex societies to function. Investors, administrators, and citizens can rely on rules that are predictable and codified. Disputes can be resolved with reference to established procedures rather than arbitrary authority. Legal frameworks facilitate commerce, property management, and social order, creating systems that support development and governance. For others, the legacy is a reminder. It signals a past in which foreign authority shaped societies, often without consent or local adaptation. It recalls the ways in which traditions, customs, and indigenous legal practices were diminished or subordinated. The persistence of British structures underscores how deeply colonial influence penetrated daily life, even after independence. It highlights the complexities of balancing inherited systems with local identity, autonomy, and cultural values. The reach of British law continues into modern governance. Legislatures, executive bodies, and judicial systems operate within frameworks shaped by history. Policymaking, regulatory standards, and administrative processes draw upon practices developed under imperial oversight. Legal education and professional training maintain continuity, producing generations of lawyers, judges, and officials fluent in inherited logic and procedure. The system endures because it provides tools for managing complexity, enforcing fairness, and ensuring accountability. Yet the human experience of law remains central. Individuals navigate systems that affect property, commerce, family, and freedom. They interpret, negotiate, and appeal. The law influences daily life, shaping opportunity, constraint, and expectation. It carries both promise and caution. Legal structures guide conduct while reflecting a legacy that is centuries old, reminding citizens of continuity and change, of order and adaptation. British law was more than rules on paper. It was a language for dispute, and an instrument for organizing society. Its influence spread far beyond the empire that introduced it, embedding itself in education, courts, and administration. It shaped economic activity, social relationships, and political authority, leaving a mark that persists today. Some praise this legacy for the order and predictability it provides. Others see it as a reminder of authority once imposed from afar. The influence continues to shape societies, requiring adaptation, reflection, and understanding. The systems endure not only because they function, but because they carry the weight of history and the expectations of generations who grew up within them. The story of British law is the story of influence that lasted long after the empire itself ended. It is a legacy felt in courts, schools, offices, and communities. It is a structure that organizes daily life, mediates conflict, and shapes opportunity. It is a reminder that law is never only about rules. It is about power, society, and memory. The legacy of British law continues, quietly, in every settlement it once touched. Thank you for listening and exploring this chapter of history with me. British law in the colonies was not just about courts and judges. It was about control, influence, and shaping the world from afar. For some, it brought fairness and order. For others, it represented imposition and loss. History asks us to understand both sides. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and take care.